Okay, Rabbi.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. I have 6:29. Is that? We're pretty informal here, Sarah.
I was going to say, with Jewish Standard Time, this is like 6:30 would be early, right? That would be like, come on.
Yeah.
Let's give people a few minutes,
Usually, we'd have some schmooze and we'd have something to eat, and we'd really be able to welcome you properly to El Paso. That would be ideal.
Well, someday, let me say, I would love to come back. It is that moment when you're trying to get everyone to move from the schmoozing to the sitting. That's like a 10 to 15 minute process. So we can leave a few minutes for it now.
Yeah, I've walked in with my shofar, before. Hey, but welcome everybody. Welcome everyone to our time this evening. I just want to start by saying, offering the ground rules that have been presented to me. Firstly, we're just going to ask everyone to remind to stay on mute, and want to thank everyone for that. And to save bandwidth also, we're going to ask everyone to turn their cameras off. That just helps us out a lot. If you have any questions over the course of the interview, whether they pertain to the moment, the conversation we are having, or whether they're with regards to anything else, especially in terms of the book we're here to discuss, please put those questions in the chat. I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on that. We'll present questions throughout and especially focus on questions after the hour of interview as well. If you're faculty or staff from El Paso Community College, we will be entering the sign-in link every 30 minutes or so into the chat. So keep your eye out for that so that you can sign in if you are faculty or staff at EPCC. And we are so grateful to have Sarah Hurwitz here with us for the second time in 2 days. Yesterday, we were blessed to have time to learn from you, Sarah, about speech writing and some of your professional experience, including in the White House with the Obamas. And for those who missed that conversation, it is available on YouTube. I want to express, again, my personal gratitude to you for the sermon writing tips as well.
Thank you.
I want to say also to you and to everybody who is present, happy Passover. And for those celebrating this weekend, of course, happy Easter as well. To all of those joining us from El Paso Community College, as well as from around the country, including those at Congregation Albert and Bethel Temple, and of course from Temple Mount Sinai, we welcome you. If you've already had a chance to read Sarah Hurwitz's book, you are as excited as I am to welcome her. Sarah Hurwitz is author of Here All Along. She served as White House speechwriter from 2009 to 2017, starting out as a senior speechwriter for President Barack Obama and then serving as chief speechwriter for First Lady Michelle Obama. Sarah also worked on policy issues affecting young women and girls as a senior advisor to the White House Council on Women and Girls. Before working at the White House, Sarah was chief speechwriter for Hillary Clinton during her 2008 presidential primary campaign. She served as deputy chief speechwriter for Senator John Kerry's 2004 presidential campaign, deputy chief speechwriter for General Wesley Clark's primary campaign, and as a speechwriter for Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa. Sarah was also a lawyer at the Washington, D.C. office of Wilmer Hale. Hurwitz has been profiled in the Washington Post, People.com, the Boston Globe, and the Guardian, interviewed on the Today Show, Morning Joe, Amanpour and Company, and NPR. And she's been featured in the Forward as one of 50 Jews who impacted American life in 2016 and 2019. She's a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, and as I mentioned, is the author of the more fully titled Here All Along, Finding Meaning, Spirituality, and a Deeper Connection to Life in Judaism After Finally Choosing to Look There. So Sarah, let me say again, it's an honor to be speaking with you right now. Your story is every rabbi's nightmare and every rabbi's dream. We were unable to adequately excite you about Judaism when you were younger, but then you rediscovered it when you were a little bit older and were more capable of wrestling with some of the really beautiful and complex meanings that Judaism has to offer us in life. It felt like a joy, not just a joy, but an honor to read your book as a rabbi and to have the opportunity to hear your voice as you talked about that journey in a way that's so accessible, and that I felt like I could really not just read and get so much out of as a rabbi, but also then share with young people as well. Because so many people lose interest as children in Judaism, and they don't pursue ongoing Jewish learning. But of course, like as a rabbi, that's what I'm really worried about and concerned about in terms of the Jewish future. And as you point out in your book, their experience of Judaism is therefore pretty childish. So to start, like what inspired you to pursue adult Jewish learning? Why did you decide to write this book on Judaism after leaving the White House?
Great question. And thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to be here. We were talking beforehand. I think this is actually the first event I have done in Texas after many, many events. So I'm really just excited to be part of this. So, it's funny, as you said, Rabbi, I grew up with, we went to the High Holy Day services twice a year. I found Hebrew school boring. And then I had my bat mitzvah and I kind of walked away, right? I thought like, okay, I'm a cultural Jew. I'm a Jew by heritage. But if I want meaning or spirituality or connection, I'll have to look elsewhere. And then fast forward 25 years later, at the age of 36, I broke up with this guy I was dating with. I was lonely and bored and just had some time on my hands. And I happened to hear about an Intro to Judaism class at the local Jewish Community Center. And I signed up totally on a whim. I just thought like, I need something to do, want to get out of my apartment. I should learn something about my heritage, right? My culture. And so I just kind of thought something to do, not a big deal. But I was blown away by what I learned in that class. This was 4,000 years of crowdsourced wisdom from millions of people about what it means to be human, about how to be a good person, about how to lead a worthy and meaningful and purposeful life, about how to find profound spiritual connection as an adult. Right? Not just God is the man in the sky who punishes you when you're naughty, but really like a grown up conception of the divine. And I just thought like, wait, where has this been all my life, right? Why didn't I see this in my services or elsewhere? And so I continued learning. I took more Intro to Judaism classes. I started attending silent Jewish meditation retreats. I read hundreds of books. And, after a while, I found myself kind of frustrated because it was actually really hard for me to learn about Judaism as an adult. I found that my options were either intro books, which were excellent with the nuts and bolts, like with the sort of how to. But if I wanted the why to, I kind of was stuck with these very esoteric academic books, many of which you read in rabbinical school, and you can confirm that they're mind numbing. I don't know what, just like so dense and hard to read. And I just felt like, where is the book that I'm looking for? The book that, covers the basics, but more importantly, unearths the deepest insights that Judaism has to offer us today. The truly radical, transformational, moving, meaningful, beautiful wisdom that actually helps us live better lives, cope with our challenges, raise our kids, form strong families and communities today. And so I decided I would try to write that book. But I do want to put a footnote here. I feel very guilty that my book starts with me not liking Hebrew school, because I actually really don't think Hebrew school is the problem. I really don't. I think Hebrew school is great. I think people are doing the best they can with Hebrew school. I think the problem is that, and I'm talking about myself, a lot of Jews like me, we stopped learning at age 13. 20 years later, we got a kid. We think someone's got to make this kid Jewish. Not me. I don't know anything. I know. I'll dump the entire project of making my child Jewish onto this Hebrew school teacher and this rabbi, and I'll get mad at them when the kid can't read Hebrew by age 10. Hebrew school teachers and rabbis can't make a child Jewish, right? Like that involves us as adults growing up, becoming adult Jews, actually learning deeply, figuring out what Judaism means to us, and then we'll know how to make our kids Jewish. So I don't like trashing Hebrew school because I think it's really unfair. And there's a lot of great Jewish educators doing wonderful work on that. So Just want to put that out there.
You know, there's a lot of conversation happening right now about how because of the pandemic, a lot of people have had to figure out what Judaism means to them because they can't or haven't not been able to offload it to the synagogue for a year now. And so there's some, you know, there's some thing there perhaps to think, you know, to help us think through, like, well, what does our home look like? What does it mean to be a Jew? So speaking of which, what are some of those things that you kind of identified as things that really gave you that meaning and felt relevant to you that you really sought to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a number of things. You know, first of all, you know, the spiritual wisdom, right? All the various conceptions of God, which I'm happy to talk more about if you'd like the ethical wisdom. You know, there was such a high ethical bar. Again, happy to kind of go into that. You know, I think beginning to understand that our holidays were incredibly sophisticated and deep. You know, it's funny to me, I'd always thought that Yom Kippur was just a boring day where you sit and kind of mutter in a synagogue for 4 hours and are hungry, like that was Yom Kippur. It's actually a 25-hour-long death meditation. You are supposed to dress up as a corpse and meditate on your own death and really think very hard about, if I died tomorrow, would it have all been worth it? Did I do it right? You know, that's radical, right? That's a profound spiritual journey, but kind of got lost among all the liturgy, right? So the profundity of the holidays really struck me. I think just the power of our life cycle rituals, you know, in modern consumer society, you know, our life cycle rituals tend to be framed as consumer events. It's like, oh, you had a baby, great, buy a lot of stuff. Oh, you're getting married, pay a lot of money for that wedding. Oh, someone you love died, I'm sorry, get a really nice casket. It's like, these are not, we don't need products or services at this time. What we need is community. What we need is time-tested wisdom. What we need is human connection. And I think Judaism understands that these periods of transition, they require support, right? They require meaning. They require someone to kind of help us through. And we have 4,000 years of wisdom on how to do that. And so I think, you know, that really struck me as something just incredibly important about Judaism. And then finally, you know, I think about kind of the key insight that I think is particularly relevant right now, which is just this core beating heart Jewish idea that we're all created in the divine image. We're all created in the image of God. And you can be an atheist, I don't, it doesn't really matter. You know, this idea, as you obviously know, it's, you know, this comes from, you know, this is really looked into deeply in ancient Jewish commentaries. And as a rabbi named Yitz Greenberg beautifully phrases it, he said, being created in the image of God means, and he's drawing on ancient texts, he says it means that we're each infinitely worthy, can't put a price on a human life, we're all equal, there's no one better or worse than anyone else, and we're each fundamentally unique. There is no one else like us. Right? That might seem like, yeah, obvious, we all believe that. Like, no, we don't. No one here actually believes that, right? Like, if we believe that, you would never walk by someone on the street who says, you know, can you spare $1? And say, oh, I'm sorry, not today, or just give them $1 and walk by. If that person had been a celebrity, you would have stopped, right? You would have asked for their autograph. You would have been so excited. You would have wanted to like spend time with them. We don't fundamentally think that a homeless person and a celebrity are equally worthy or equally unique. We just don't. We value people differently based on their status, their wealth, their beauty, their fame. And the core Jewish idea is actually quite a radical challenge to that. It's actually saying, no, actually, that homeless person and that celebrity, they are both created in the divine image. And I think trying to live up to that standard is it's pretty challenging.
Do you have any, like, going off script here for a second, do you have any suggestions or guidance to us on how to get better at doing that as you've been thinking about that and as you've lived your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it comes from Jewish ethical law, right? Like, I think, you know, when I look into what I've learned in Jewish ethics was basically that, like, I kind of realized that I was actually kind of living by the modern secular consumerist ethic of like, do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt other people too much, and like be nice, and like, you know, give a little to the poor, be nice, which is like, it's such a low bar, right? Like, that's a fine bar for American law, which is really designed to kind of protect our property and our civil rights and our physical safety. But Jewish ethical law actually demands quite a lot more. It's really based on this idea that we have obligations, not just rights. Right? We actually owe things to people. We don't just have freedom from them. And so, when I started studying this, I just realized it was such a tremendously high bar. It wasn't even, the rule wasn't just give money to the poor, however you want, however much. There's like thousands of pages of thinking, which you've studied, obviously, which talks about exactly how much, precisely how you give. There's this whole body of thinking of like, how do you give to someone in need in a way that doesn't humiliate them, that empowers them, that respects their dignity? I mean, there are laws that say if you've loaned someone money and you know they can't pay you back, avoid running into them on the street because you don't want to embarrass them. There's a law that says that even someone who's a recipient of tzedakah, of financial assistance, they have to give tzedakah because no one should feel just like a taker. And as I read these, I realized like Jewish ethical law is actually cultivating this exquisite sensitivity to the needs and the dignity of other people. And so when I hear that old sort of lie that Christianity is a religion of love, but Judaism is a religion of law, it's just so foolish because our laws are how we express love for each other, right? It's not just, yeah, give money if you feel like it, maybe. It's a really detailed system of urging you to give in a way that expresses love and kindness and sensitivity to others. So I think that, studying these Jewish ethical laws, they really are very much geared towards helping us recognize the divine image in other people.
And I think for a lot of people, or for a lot of religious traditions, the idea of having a God who is up there sort of saying, this is what you do, and the old man in the clouds sort of perspective is what people think about when they think about God. But as you wrote about, Judaism is so much more complex than that. So what does God, that word that we use so often, that we talk about so much, that we use in our prayer services, what does that mean to you now that you've spent so much time thinking and reflecting on Judaism and your Jewish identity?
Yeah, I mean, you put it perfectly. That was precisely my conception of God growing up, right? And I'm looking at this on the Siddur or prayer book with no knowledge, no understanding, and thinking, well, they refer to God as a he, seems like he controls everything. Like, come on, I don't buy it. None of these arguments made sense to me. It's like, what about the Holocaust? The whole thing, I was like, okay, no. So I just thought, okay, I must be an atheist, or maybe like spiritual but not religious, whatever that means. And that's actually not true. If you actually take the time to learn about Jewish theology, what you realize is that there isn't one simplistic dogma of God, right? We as Jews have the humility to say, when we say the word God, we are talking about something so far beyond our ability as human beings to narrowly define or categorize or create some dogma around. To do so is actually to commit idolatry. Once you shrink something that is ineffable and mysterious and infinite down to the limits that our tiny little human minds can comprehend, you've then created an idol. And that idol tends to hate this group of people. And, you see a lot of that kind of idolatry in modern American life. We don't do that as Jews. Instead, what we have are centuries and centuries of commentary, where it's people kind of coming up with their own idea of God, the divine, based on their own lived experience and their understanding of Jewish tradition. So you have, Jewish mystics who say that God is everything. Right? You all are God, I'm God. The idea that there's any barrier between us, that's an illusion, right? We're all one. So in my previous example, that homeless individual on the street and that celebrity, they're both God, right? They're both the divine, which, that's an interesting way to look at the world. You have Martin Buber, who's a Jewish thinker, who says that God is what arises between two people in deep human relation, right? Two people being fully vulnerable to each other, fully seeing each other's humanity. What arises in those moments of deep connection is God. You have a rabbi named Mordechai Kaplan who says that God is the process by which we each become our highest and truest selves. So I realized there was this incredible diversity of Jewish theology. Now, we as Jews have a sense that divine, whatever it is, it does call us to act in a certain way. We certainly, there's very clear laws and commandments and things we're supposed to do. But as to what that is, we have the humility to say, actually, we don't know. We know there's something, but we're not going to try to shrink it into an idol. I also found that finally kind of having some experience really matters. Having a felt sense of the divine is quite important. And I think that because people think God is a man in the sky, they feel like they can't experience that because they don't believe in it. But we've all had spiritual experiences, whether or not we name them as such. I mean, a rabbi named Art Green, who's written many wonderful books, he has a beautiful passage in one of his books where he says, like, think about the moment when your child was born, when your parent took their last breath, when you were out in nature and just swept away, just awed by the beauty around you, when you were swept away by a piece of art or music, when you were in deep connection with another person. Like, we have all had these moments that feel somehow transcendent. And if you actually look at a lot of Jewish theology, it's kind of reflecting some of that, which is quite interesting. So in terms of me personally, what do I think God is? I agree with the mystics. I think God is everything, everywhere. I think it's the animating energy of the universe. I do think God is a force that brings growth and actualization. I do find God in relation. I certainly don't think God is a being. I relate to God as a being. I relate to God as a you because I'm a human being. I want relation. I can't relate to a force. I can't relate to an everything. If you asked a tree what it calls God, I don't know, it's a tree, right? It might have a different language, but that's my language. Now, you can say that makes no sense. God can't be a force and a being. It's totally incoherent. And my answer is yes. Welcome to Jewish theology. You study our ancient rabbis whose commentaries are the basis of all Jewish law. In one breath, they're talking about God as totally transcendent, beyond time, space, human imagination. In the next breath, they're talking about God as totally immanent, right here in the world, available for relationship, talking to us. Those two things can't be true, but they didn't care, right? That's the humility. That's the playfulness that we have with Jewish theology, is an understanding that there's something there. We're trying to get glimpses and glimmers of it, even if we can't totally define it.
That old Jewish stereotype of two Jews, three opinions extends even to God, right?
Like, even to God. In fact, someone, a rabbi I know, said once, like, the key Jewish rule on God is one God or fewer. That's the key. Yeah. One God or fewer.
The other piece of that is, it's so beautiful. What you've said is so beautifully stated in terms of why we might pick up a prayer book, right? Ancient Jewish liturgy, and see God described in many different ways, but in particular ways in ancient liturgy. And then we talk with one another and we're like, well, no, that's not actually how we think about God, right? Like, those are the ancient prayers. So, I mean, to kvetch for a minute, like, it makes the rabbi's job so much more difficult, because people are looking at prayer books and going, what, but did God like this? What are you talking about? And then,
it's so frustrating. And also, scripted communal prayer in a synagogue is not the only Jewish spiritual practice, but Jews seem to think it is. Like, individual, personal, spontaneous prayer is a uniquely Jewish practice. Not uniquely, it's a natively Jewish practice. Open the Torah. What are they doing in there? They're just talking to God. No prayer book necessary. We have a meditation tradition. We have a blessing tradition. Study is considered a form of Jewish worship. So just, I feel so badly that rabbis are kind of constantly having to just work with and defend this one kind of Jewish spiritual practice, when there's actually a whole range out there, but many Jews don't think the rest of that stuff is authentic, right? They're like, no, only this prayer that I don't like and don't understand, that's the only real Jewish prayer. And like, it's not true.
Yeah, it really goes back to your early experience about, so this is what Judaism is. No thanks,
Exactly.
And how to teach these complex and complicated ideas to children is, it's not just, my challenge, it's our challenge as a people, which is one of the reasons why I appreciated what you wrote, your book so much.
And keep in mind, this is a relatively new challenge, right? This is like, Jews used to live in insular Jewish communities where Jewish life was just lived, right? You just lived it. You lived those things. You didn't need to teach your kid how to read Hebrew. They lived that, right? You were doing it, and we don't live in it that way anymore. And so now we're trying to teach it, and like, we don't proselytize, so we don't actually have a lot of experience translating this into something to teach to people. That's just not, to teach to people who have no background. It's not really what we do. So it's a challenge.
With regards to sort of how to get out of the sanctuary, whether it's a physical space or the sanctuary of our minds and our hearts, like, in terms of living the ethics of Jewish life, what was learning about Jewish ethics like for you? And, how did you find that your study of Jewish ethics affected your life on a daily basis, or on a real world basis?
Yeah. It's funny. I think that, I just think studying the Jewish laws about speech was very sobering for me. There's so much Jewish thinking about gossip, about shaming people. And, I'd always thought of gossip as like, I'm going to tell you this malicious secret rumor about this person. But Jewish law actually defines it much more broadly. So meaning, an example might be, I get into an argument with a colleague, I'm so angry at her. And that night I go home and I just call 5 friends and I just tell them how awful she is. She's not smart. She's bad at her job. She's lazy. I don't trust her. She's dishonest. Just so angry. And I get it off my chest and then I feel better. Next morning we come back to work and we make up. Right? It was a misunderstanding. I've just told 5 people a bunch of pretty terrible things about her. And maybe those 5 people each told a couple people who each told a couple people. I don't know, maybe a month from now, my colleague decides to go looking for a new job and she sends a resume out and it happens to land in the inbox of one of those people who found out the things I said, who happens to be the HR person at the company. And she's like, I think I remember hearing some bad stuff about this woman. We should pass. But it's like the thing that I said just to get off my chest, right? That's actually a real problem. It's lashon hara, right? It's some sort of evil tongue or evil speech, right? I've really caused a pretty serious problem. So I now just, before I hit send on the email, before I say the thing, I do sometimes pause for a minute and think, do I want to do this? Do I still do it too often? Yes, I do. I am nowhere near, I'm no saint, but I do sometimes pause. I think similarly with shaming. If you look on social media, all it is people shaming each other. I don't even know if anyone ever has a real discussion. They just want to humiliate and call each other out and shame each other. And Jewish law actually compares shaming someone to murdering them because the rabbis observe that in both cases, the blood drains from the person's face. And you can say okay, that's a little hyperbolic. But if you think back to your childhood and a moment where you were publicly humiliated, you can still feel it. I guarantee you, decades later, you still remember moments where you were really deeply shamed. Shame leaves quite a scar. It leaves a real stain on us. And the rabbis just urge us to go out of our way to avoid that. So I think it has in many ways changed how I've acted on a daily basis.
I've often thought about how, like you said, so much of most of Jewish history was lived in community, just sort of obvious community with structures around it that sort of kept people connected and close. And so if you violated that ethic of community, that was really bad, really detrimental. It was in some ways like spilling blood. You really had an impact, not only on the person that you're interacting with or speaking badly about, but on the entire community as a whole. And
Yes.
We don't think about that as often because we don't live in society in the same way, many of us.
Yes, that's right.
So thinking about Jewish ethics from that perspective sort of changed my way of thinking about, well, what does it mean to be an ethical person? It's to see everybody you encounter, the celebrity or the homeless person on the street, as another person in your inner circle, in your community, in your society. It changes the way you approach everybody.
Yes.
How do you recommend? A question came in. So do you have children? If so, but I'm going to say whether or not you have children. How do we instill this sort of value or these ethical values in our children? How do we help them to see what you've learned in your studies?
I think the first thing, and what I think, I'm not a parent and I'm not an educator, so I tread very lightly here because I have no expertise or authority. But what I do feel comfortable saying is the first thing we have to do, we really have to do the learning. Just kind of having a sense that Judaism says to treat the poor with dignity or not to gossip. That's not enough. But you actually have to kind of do some real learning where you're kind of diving in to the many, many situations that our ancient rabbis considered and really beginning to understand the nuances and the moral force of the law. And that's where you begin to kind of be able to live it out in your life. That's where you begin to really be able to articulate it with your kids. So I think the first step is learning this stuff, really kind of immersing yourself, understanding the real, just like the reasoning behind it. And then I think a lot of it is modeling it, and narrating what you're doing. It's like, I've decided, I was about to say this thing about this person, and you know what? I decided not to, and here's why, because I read this story about this, and here's what happened. Actually narrating the way you're modeling something, I think, can be so powerful for kids.
I think I was gonna say that as well, that modeling piece. So often we do meaningful, helpful, good things and don't share them. And that's important, right? We don't want to do things because it's going to get us some kind of reward. But when we don't share that we've done it with our children, we lose the opportunity to model that. Today I spent a couple hours at the soup kitchen or at the food bank. Yeah, you don't want to put that on Facebook. That's not particularly helpful, right? But your children, they look up to you as a parent. Share it with them, model it.
Absolutely. So I think that's exact, and connect it explicitly to your Jewish values. It's like, I do this because it's important to me. It's meaningful because our tradition tells us this, and here's why, and this is what, like really rooting it in Jewish values, I think, can make a huge difference for kids.
Speaking of which, how do you, how would you define the Jewish approach to social justice? How do you think about that?
Yeah, something that drives me a little bit crazy sometimes, I hope this doesn't seem harsh, but when people will say, like, social justice is my Judaism, and it's like, that's beautiful. It's also your Christianity and your Islam and your Buddhism, and you're just being a decent secular person, right? Judaism, we don't own social justice. It's actually part of every major world religious tradition. However, we have a very particular approach to social justice, which I think is embedded in our most core founding story, which appropriate to talk about this week, Passover. You look at kind of our founding story as a people, as a nation, it's about this kind of, helpless bunch of Israelite slaves who are rescued from slavery in Egypt. They're put into freedom by God. They're assembled around the base of Mount Sinai. And the mission that God essentially gives to them is to create a society that is the exact opposite of Egypt. That's kind of what the laws in the Torah are dictating. This Jewish God is saying, I don't care about emperors and kings and pharaohs. That's not what our focus is in this new society. What we're really focused on is the widow, the orphan, the poor, the stranger, right? There is like such an obsession in the Torah, in all of the laws dictated by this Jewish God, with those who are vulnerable, right? Like, that's really the focus. And kind of your job is to create a society where we care about these people, where we take care of them, where we see those who are struggling. And so I think when I think about kind of the Jewish approach to social justice, it is very much rooted in that core narrative. And so, is that different from other ideas of other religions' notions of social justice? No, I think the core idea is pretty similar, but it's rooted in this very specific narrative. And what makes it uniquely Jewish is the execution, right? How do we carry this out? You look at the laws around, the Torah dictates around every 7 years, you let the fields lie fallow. And so those who are in need can come and they can eat from them, and the fields rest. Every 50 years, all the land that's been bought and sold, it all goes back to the original owners when it was sort of equally divided up among the Israelite tribes, right? There's a sense there that there's a Jewish discomfort with massive collections of wealth and with income inequality. So I think, understanding that there is kind of a Jewish story behind the social justice and a Jewish approach to it, I think that's pretty important.
You have me thinking about something that's really counterintuitive to most people, and it's true of most Jews, and that is that generally in Judaism, it is seen as better to do something because you feel like you have to than because you want to, right? So, and I think you used words like obligation and job. It is our job to do these things. It's not because we want to out of the kindness of our hearts. It's because we feel this sense of Jewish obligation to do these things. Like, it's not a choice.
Exactly. And I think sometimes people think, well, the feeling has to lead to the action. Like, first I have to feel moved to be kind, and then I commit an act of kindness. And Judaism's like, no, we don't actually care how you feel right now. You do the act of kindness, and, it will probably actually lead you to feel a certain feeling in your heart. You'll actually realize, oh, this is important. And if not, that's okay. You still do the act of kindness. And is it better to do the act out of a feeling of kindness in your heart? It is better. I think Jewish law does indicate that. It doesn't really matter how you feel though, right? You do doing the act actually leads to the feeling rather than the feeling leading to the act. And I think that's something that often people are kind of confused about with Jewish law. But the idea of the word mitzvah does not mean good deed. It means commandment, right? It means like you do these things because you're obligated to do them.
And a question came in, and I think I'm interpreting it correctly. Are there ways to help elderly people to kind of learn and to grow in Jewish ethics and values?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I think like there's so much great adult education out there. I think people can learn I've been in adult education classes with people in their 90s, right? You're never too old to learn. I remember, gosh, a woman came up to me at an event once and she'd started learning about Judaism in her mid 80s. And, and she'd said, if you think you're late coming to this in your mid 30s, nah, you can always learn. So, I think it's possible at any time.
Are there avenues for education that might approach or kind of give someone access to some of these thoughts who isn't Jewish? Sort of this style or this way of thinking about ethics and about social justice that you can
absolutely. I mean, I think first of all, adult education classes at synagogues, at Jewish learning institutes, I've never encountered one that wasn't open to someone because of their background, right? You would never, I'm sure you would never turn someone away who wanted to learn, but by giving them some religious test, right? We don't proselytize because we think people are fine the way they are, but anyone who wants to come in and learn, of course, is welcome. So, I think that local synagogues are a great place to learn, and that learning is happening generally online right now, which makes it even more accessible, especially for people who have mobility constraints or who have transportation constraints. Synagogues are offering these classes online. JCCs, Jewish Community Centers, they offer them online. There's an organization called Melton, which does adult Jewish learning. If you just Google adult Jewish learning, you will find so much out there. But, classes are one way to learn. Books are another way to learn. In the appendix to my book, I actually have a whole list of books that I think are the most excellent Jewish books, the most accessible, the most engaging, the most substantive, and I've organized them by category. So, I think once you have a basic kind of intro background to Judaism, then you can dive in with whatever you're most passionate about. Finally, I think experience is really important. It's great to read about Shabbat. That's wonderful. But I think it's important to actually try it, right? Just try it out. See how, plan a Shabbat dinner, see how it goes, try out the prayers, see what they feel like. You can read about the liturgy and you can read about going to a Jewish service, but it's important just to attend, see how it goes. I think I'm a big fan of silent Jewish meditation retreats, which are not for everyone, but they are for me. And those have been powerful spiritual experiences. And again, in my book's appendix, I recommend organizations that host those. So I think there are so many ways for people to learn, and none of these things are limited just to Jews, right? Like in every one of these places, I have seen people who are not Jewish being part of them.
Another question came in with regards to values and ethics. How do you think about in terms of either kind of projecting backwards into your work as a speechwriter in the White House or in what you're up to right now, when values, religious Jewish values, come into conflict with whatever secular sort of values or secular ethic is being put forward at the moment? How do you recommend squaring that?
It's funny, this is a question I often get about my time in the White House, which is well, what happens when you have to write a speech that conflicts with your values, which is an important question. And my answer is, I don't. I don't, because I never write for people whose values I don't share, right? I always write for people who have similar values to mine. So, in my work in politics, I always felt like I was furthering my Jewish values, right? I didn't really feel that conflict. There had been moments just in in life in general or work where there's, in an interpersonal interaction or in something I've been asked to do, I felt like this doesn't feel right? That little flag of conscience or that sense of like, this doesn't feel like it's on the up and up. And I'm a big believer in always honoring that voice. Might be a lawyer in me, but it's like, if you have any concerns, I've always been told the New York Times test, like, would you want this on the front page of the New York Times? If the answer is no, don't do it, right? Push back, say no. So I think it's a generally good standard to adhere to.
Nice. I had one teacher who said, if you wouldn't want your grandmother to know about it, don't do it.
That's great.
I'm going to put a couple of questions together that have come in, if that's okay.
Great.
It stays on this idea of living a Jewish life and being a member of secular society, which many of us Jews are, sort of trying to balance and to juggle at the same time too. The question is, in your book, you mentioned you don't necessarily keep kosher, or one thing that I thought of was that you kind of experimented with Shabbat, but then you wrote about how you sort of had at a moment you had to give that up a little bit more than you really wanted to. So how do you think about the challenge of engaging in deep, meaningful Jewish life, while at the same time not necessarily being sort of like behaving in like strict traditionally Jewish ways? Both, the questions that came in were both with regards to kashrut and also with Shabbat, but just more generally, how do you balance that? And how do you suggest we balance that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to get very clear about what kind of Jew you want to be, right? Are you someone who wants to be, do you want to have kind of an Orthodox observance where you're really having a rigorous kosher kashrut practice, where you're observing Shabbat rigorously, where or do you want to have, a non-Orthodox observance? Do you want to have a Reform Jewish observance, which is about informed choice and kind of, figuring out what you want to do and what you don't? So I think the first step is really, it's just important to get clear about what your values are and what matters to you. And I think once you've discerned that, I think fighting for it is so important. When I was in the White House, as you mentioned, I wanted to experiment with a somewhat rigorous Shabbat practice. That was important to me. And so I did that for a few months, and my colleagues they were so supportive. They could not have been more supportive. And I did it, and it was very meaningful. And after a while, I kind of realized, okay, this is getting challenging, and I just don't feel that strongly about doing this. Like, this has been a good experiment, but I don't actually feel like it's critical for me. Like, it just personally, that didn't feel like it was critical for me to express my Judaism. It just wasn't something that was kind of meaningful and central enough for me. And so my decision was to pull back on my Shabbat practice and kind of integrate it more with work. I think similarly, there was a year where Mrs. Obama gave a speech in, I think it was October of 2016, and it was kind of during the height of the campaign, and it was about misogyny that she was seeing in the election. And it was a really searing, kind of raw speech, just talking about, the culture of, misogyny and mistreatment of women, about sexual assault. I mean, it was a very powerful, kind of early Me Too speech, actually. And the speech was being given the day after Yom Kippur. And, I remember I kind of, a few days before, I told my colleagues, like, all right, guys, I'm offline for 25 hours. I'll get back online the night before and I'll make the edits, but I'm just off. And then I began to realize, like, that's not realistic, right? The speech is really high profile and important. It's getting a lot of attention. Edits are coming in. So I then sent an email like, okay, I'll be off for, Kol Nidre and the morning service. I kept, and then by the end, I was like, okay, I'll be off for Kol Nidre. I'm going to go to the morning services. I'm going to check email after a couple hours. And if edits come in, I will then leave, which is what I did. Now, I actually thought a lot about that. And I didn't do that because I felt like, oh, if I don't do it, I'll get in trouble, right? I didn't even tell Mrs. Obama I was doing that because she would have been so upset. She would have felt so badly. But I thought very deeply about the Jewish values at play. And it's actually not, Jewish values is Orthodox observance of Yom Kippur, and anything else is not Jewish values. That's not true, right? There is an incredible Jewish value to giving a speech that gives voice to those who are most vulnerable, most oppressed, right? That's a core Jewish value that's very important to me. I also think it's important to have a real ritual observance around major holidays like Yom Kippur. I talked to several rabbis. I really thought through, how do I want this to look? And then I lived it out. I did go to services. I also did do some work. I fasted the whole time. I really thought through that very carefully. And so that was me being intentional, right? Being really clear on what my kind of Judaism was going to be. So I think, the truth is, like, we're all picking and choosing. Like, find me the most observant person ever. I guarantee you I can find someone more observant, right? Even these very observant people who say, no, yes, you are, right? You can always, we're all picking and choosing. And the key is to pick and choose in a way that feels authentic and ethical to you. So that's what I've tried to do.
I, as a Reform rabbi, have to just jump in there for the argument, to say this sounds like such a Reformed Jewish philosophical approach. But I know that we're also, you seem to, in your book, sort of try to avoid denominational identity and totally get that. But just a plug.
Yeah.
I also want to point out, just as you're talking and as we're talking, there are a lot of great comments coming in the chat for everybody who's with us to take a look at, including suggestions for books to read, and after they read your book, of course, and things like that. So just to point that out, because I'm not going to be able to mention all of the great pieces of literature that people should be checking out. But one question that came in was, we've talked about God. We've talked about Jewish ethics. We've talked about social justice. Like, we've covered a lot about what Judaism is. But in terms of how it's different from other religions, like, how would you talk about Judaism as being different from other religious traditions? What makes it? Oh
man, that is a brilliant question. I haven't studied other religious traditions in more than just the most surface way. So I'm not comfortable characterizing any other tradition. But what I think is unique about Judaism, I think there's a few things. I think number one, the centrality of action is really key. My understanding of Christianity is, like, faith is quite key. If you say, well, I'm Christian, but I no longer believe in God, nor do I believe in Jesus, or that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, it's kind of tough to claim that you're still Christian, right? That is kind of like the core thing in Christianity, is to have that faith, right? That profession of faith. In Judaism, like, I can literally violate every Jewish law tomorrow. I can claim not to be Jewish, but, like, I am still Jewish. I was born from Jewish parents. Jewish law will still consider me Jewish. So I do think, Judaism is not just a religion. It is actually a peoplehood that has a religion. And, when you're a member of the peoplehood, whether or not you buy into the religion, you're still part of the people. That's very confusing for people. So I think it's different from other religious traditions, and that it's more than a religion, first of all. I think, second of all, our approach to Jewish law, it's just quite extraordinary, right? Like, we kind of, instead of dogma or sort of hierarchy or authority, we have this kind of millennia-long conversation and debate that's still ongoing. We're just constantly, we have these core values that are kind of laid out in the Torah, and we're constantly interpreting our text to ensure that we continue to carry out those values in each new era. It's actually very similar to how we approach the US Constitution. Original draft of that document, not so great, like slavery, the women not voting, but also pretty great in some core values around liberties and freedoms. Very important. We've spent 250 years interpreting that document, right? And same thing with the Torah, right? We spent 2,500 years reinterpreting this document such that, we don't stone people for not observing Shabbat. We don't put each other's eyes out. In fact, that was actually reinterpreted 2,000 years ago. And I think that constantly iterative reinterpreting kind of tradition, that emphasis on questioning and debate and argument, that's really special. I think that's a really special thing about our tradition. And I think just in general, my friends of other faiths are often shocked that, like, you can challenge the rabbi. They're like, really? Is that okay? I was like, no, the rabbi likes that, right?
No, everybody listening, the rabbi doesn't like that.
Questions are welcome. There is the sense that we get to the truth, we get to depth and truth by debating, right? By kind of sharing each other's ideas, and not in a nasty way, not in a way of trying to win, but what's known as argument for the sake of heaven. It's argument to go deeper, right? It's respectful argument where I'm going to listen to your position, I'm going to appreciate it, I'm going to share my position, you're going to appreciate it, we're going to keep going as we go deeper. And I think that emphasis on study even as understood as kind of a way of worship. Um, the idea is like, we kind of connect with the divine by, like, revelation wasn't a one-time deal at Mount Sinai by God. Like, we're continuing to kind of hear and discern revelation in each new era by studying, by learning, by debating, by reinterpreting. And I think that is just tremendously special. It's something that I just love about Judaism, that sensibility.
I agreed. I mean, amen. Ditto. All of those things. And I'm wondering, as a communications and as a messaging person, how do we do a better job of sharing this that you're talking about, that we all hope to share with the Jewish people, Jewish communities, and the broader community as well? Like, how do we get the message of how beautiful Judaism is out there in a better way, on top of all of us going out and reading your book? Which, I mean, I'm not, and I'm not trying to blow smoke at all. I really, truly think you accomplished what you set out to do, which is to not worry about getting all of the things in there, but to share the essence of what it is that we are and what we're about. And just, I applaud you, and I'm so grateful.
Oh, thank you.
But how do we do it on a broader perspective? All of us, how do we do more, and how do we do it better?
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, because, when I'm saying that you have to go learn, trust me, as someone who went and did that, it was so hard, and no one has thousands of hours for this, right? People are just getting by, right? Especially right now, especially if you have kids you're taking care of, parents you're taking care of. People are so stretched so thin. So to even tell people, oh, take a class, okay, they might not have time. They might not be able to make it. They might not be able to afford it, whatever it is. So I wanted to kind of give them this book to say, okay, I did the work, right? I spent the 3,000 hours, and I'm trying to distill for you really the best stuff. And then here's a roadmap. Here's an appendix with a bunch of resources for you to learn more deeply. So I thank you for that kind of, for seeing that. In terms of messaging, I think one message that I find difficult is just, in some parts of the Jewish world, there's this message that kind of goes like, Judaism equals anti-Semitism plus Israel. And, look, anti-Semitism is a terrifying and growing problem. Let's be very clear, okay? Especially in the last 5 years, like, we have just seen a rise in anti-Semitism here in America, around the world. It is big, it is real, and it's always been around. And I sadly don't see it going away anytime soon. So that's a huge issue. Israel has always been central to the Jewish people, right? This is a tremendous and important and beautiful part of our tradition. These are two important things. But what about the other 4,000 years of Judaism? What about our holidays and life cycle rituals and ethics and spirituality and history and culture and languages and food and arts, right? We have this incredible, vast tradition that is so breathtaking. It is this incredible inheritance that we have. And to shrink it down to just two issues, and two issues that can be controversial, can be difficult and divisive, and to focus obsessively on those two issues and say those are Judaism, I think it's disrespectful. I think it's a disservice to our incredible tradition, and I find it frustrating. So I would rather see a message more along the lines of Judaism equals 4,000 years of crowdsourced wisdom from millions of people about how to be a good person and lead a meaningful and beautiful life and find profound spiritual connection and find deep and sustaining community. Right? That's the message I want to see, this very positive message about what we bring for ourselves into the world. So that's kind of more the direction I'd like to go in.
Yes. Thank you. How do you, we've been doing this for a long time, as you mentioned, for 4,000 years. And yet this moment is a very, very unique, challenging moment with the pandemic that we're all in the middle of. How do you have any sense from, not just from your book and the work that you did in preparing for the book, but the thinking you've done afterwards, the conversations you've had since, do you have any sense of any of the what some of the long-term effects might be from this moment on the life of the Jewish community?
Yeah, I mean, I think you put it beautifully earlier on when you were saying, like, suddenly people are having to figure out how to do Judaism, right? It's not just we can't just keep doing the thing we've always been doing and just kind of being wrote about it, we actually have to really think about, well, what are we doing? And why are we doing it? And what does it really mean? I mean, I'm thinking of this incredibly moving story of that I learned that actually took place in Texas, I believe. And it was a woman who very sadly had lost her husband to COVID, her husband of 30 years. And, everything was in lockdown. They couldn't have a funeral. They couldn't have a Shiva. It was a public, big community funeral or Shiva. It was heartbreaking. And she started doing some research about Jewish mourning and death rituals. And she learned about this ritual by which at the end of a funeral, everyone who's come, they line up in two lines and the mourners walk through the two lines, and all of their friends and family and community kind of shower them with condolences and love and support. She thought, like, what a beautiful tradition. And so she came up with an idea. She had her community drive their cars to the synagogue parking lot. They lined their cars up into two lines, and she and her family, the mourners, they drove through the two lines, and people waved and they blew kisses. And she really got to the beating heart of that tradition because she had to. And that to me is quite a powerful testament to what I think we really need, which it is this substance, right? It is this literacy, it is this understanding of what our traditions really mean, what the beating heart of them is. And, I'll say that, for a long time in America, like, we almost kind of, I think, thought of Judaism as, quote, an ethnicity, which it is not. Jews are every race and every ethnicity. There's not one authentic Jewish ethnicity. But in America, it kind of took on that valence. You were Irish American or Italian American or Jewish American. And that's nice, but who cares about being Irish or Italian American anymore? Like, for whom is that really their core defining identity they live in the world? Some people, not a lot, right? 3, 4, 5 generations, kind of ethnic identities in America, they tend to fade. There have actually been studies that show that people who are Latino or Hispanic, the longer they're in America, the less likely they are to identify as Hispanic or Latino. We have a very strong assimilationist impulse. So when we treat Judaism only as a peoplehood, only as like an ethnic identity, it fades, right? That's just not sustainable in an assimilationist country like America. So we need to know the substance of Judaism, right? We actually need to understand Judaism and do Judaism because we're no longer living in these insular communities where Judaism just happens. And so I think about that woman's story a lot. And I think it's probably indicative of what a lot of people have been doing now, of beginning to figure out, like, oh, okay, so we have mourners who need to say Kaddish. Well, how will we do that? Well, okay, why are we doing it? What does it mean? How do we honor that tradition? Oh, we have these kids who are becoming bar and bat mitzvahs. Okay, what's that about? Why are we doing it? Oh, maybe it's not just the party, because we can't have the party. So what is it about? I think that's powerful. I think that's really powerful.
One of the questions that came in about sort of your thinking about the studies that you did was, do you have a favorite read, like traditional Jewish reading, or a reading from the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible? Oh, the other note I took down was that you used a term Shiva that I just wanted to define. Shiva is the 7-day mourning period following a death, where the family usually not in a non-pandemic era, would welcome people into their homes or into a shared space to pray together and to be together and to allow the mourners to grieve.
Yes, and people traditionally do it for 7 days, but people will do it for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. It's many ways to do it. The traditional text. I mean, my gosh, like there are like thousands. There are so many of them that I could cite that I found moving and wise and just inspiring. I think I happen to like the Hashkivenu prayer, which is a prayer from the evening liturgy. Traditionally, traditional Jews will pray 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. And the Hashkivenu is part of that evening prayer service. And when you do like a Friday night Shabbat service, part of that will actually be recited there. And I find this prayer very moving because in it, we ask God to lay over us a canopy of peace. But the word canopy, it's strange that it's even translated, because the word is actually sukkah, which, a sukkah is a very fragile open air structure that we build during the holiday of Sukkot, which is to celebrate when we were wandering in the desert in kind of these fragile shelters. And so, it doesn't like protect you from much. like asking God for the protection of a sukkah, it's not really asking for much, right? We don't ask God to create for us, an underground cave or underground bunker to be at peace there. We don't ask God to create a fortified castle of peace. We ask for like a sukkah of peace. And I think there's a real spiritual lesson there where we're asking to be at peace even amongst the kind of fragile open air structures that are our lives, right? Like there is, I think, a spiritual lesson that, you can't really experience true peace and joy by just locking yourself away. You actually have to learn to experience peace even amidst the storm and the winds and the rain, because if you can stand being in that fragile shelter, you'll also feel the sun and the breeze. Like that's what our lives are. And I just think that's a really very profound lesson.
And and talk about one of those moments, like the storms, right? The chaos that we're living in now.
Exactly.
What have you thought about what a sequel looks like? What's the stuff that fell to the cutting room floor, or what are the things that oh man, I wish I would have done that? Is there anything?
I think I would like to write another book, though I will admit I've really been struggling to do so during this pandemic. Just find it hard to think, hard to be creative. Like it's really been challenging. And I think I'm beginning to realize that a lot of writers are having similar struggles. But I would like to write a book really focused on spirituality and God and the divine. I just, that is an area that I kind of wish we as Jews explored more and were more comfortable talking about and dove more into. I almost think that like the modern Jewish response to God is kind of this epic, awkward silence. And I understand that, right? That is, I think, in some ways reflects the fact that our theology, it kind of crashed, after the Holocaust, right? You have this just event of such radical evil where it's like nothing is comprehensible in light of that. Right? So the idea that there is a God in light of that, it's very, I think a lot of Jews are understandably just, there's some real challenges there, but I think that we need to actually have this conversation. So that's something I would like to write about.
Well, if it helps, that is something I would like to read that you've written about, right? So
okay, one book sale. I'll get one book sale.
I want to point out the link for faculty development credit is going into the chat every once in a while, and was supposed to do that at the 7 o'clock hour as well. But just to mention that we're going into the last 30 or so minutes of this, although I've been trying to keep up with some of the questions that have come into the chat, as well as asking the questions that we had been hoping to ask of you, and grateful for your willingness to be on here with us this evening.
Of course, a pleasure.
To continue a little bit on the conversation that we've been discussing, that we've been having, in your dreams, what does Jewish life or Jewish community look like? Not next year and not 10 years, but 20 years, 40 years from now, what is your hope for the future of Jewish life?
Good question. I think, first of all, as I'm sure it's probably obvious from what I've been saying, I think it looks much more literate. I think it looks like Jews who really have a sense of the core teachings, the core meanings, the core traditions that Judaism offers for them. And, I don't think you do that as a kid, right? Like I think kids can get a sense of joy and warmth and love and connection and identity for sure. But, when you're 8 years old, it's like, okay, let's dive into the many conceptions of God, right? Possible, but not, I think it's tough. I actually think the post-college kind of pre-baby family time, I would love to see that understood to be the time that Jews really dive in. Right. It's a time when I think a lot of Jews are asking a lot. They're asking a lot of questions. I've been working a lot with this population in recent months, and they have a lot of questions about how to live their life, about how to create the families that they want to create, how to find the careers they want to find. And I think they have the maturity and some of the time and some of, the income to actually start learning. So I think that that's a time I'd want to really be framed as, okay, this is the moment where you do some real learning. I also think, the truth is, I think American synagogues are in some ways structured around kind of a Jewish community that may not fully exist anymore. So much of synagogue life really is structured around families with kids. It's kind of structured around life cycle rituals like You get married in the synagogue, you have your kids, you send them to the Hebrew school, they get the bar and bat mitzvah, and right now 50% of Jews, just like 50% of the American population, they're not married. I think it's something like only 39% of Jews ages 25 to 54 have children. So, you're looking at a Jewish population, the majority of which actually aren't the kind of families with kids. And so, and this is tough because I think a lot of Judaism, the unit of engagement is the family, it's the community, it's a little bit less so the individual, right? That's kind of, Christianity, I think, is more about like individual relationship with God. Judaism is much more, a lot of it happens in the family home, it happens in community. So I think beginning to kind of do some of what we do so well, which is reinterpreting, right? Just as our ancient rabbis, Jews used to worship God by sacrificing animals at a large temple in Jerusalem. In the year 70, the Romans destroyed that temple. And suddenly it's like, wait, how do we worship God? And a group of rabbis, they've just radically reinterpreted Judaism to account for this huge change. And I think we're seeing another change today in America in our family structures. So I can think envisioning Jewish institutions that really cater to people who aren't just families with kids, I think is important. And you're seeing a lot of that now. There are all these just wonderful Jewish organizations that are doing deep Judaism around certain issues, social justice, environmentalism. There's an organization I love called Svara, which is it's known as a queer radical yeshiva, where they kind of embrace the queer community and those who they say are queer-minded, because the idea is like, just like these ancient rabbis were kind of fringy, they were kind of queer, and they really reinterpreted Judaism. They say we need people today who have that outsider's perspective, who have that fresh way of looking, who can really learn deeply and reinterpret Judaism. So I think those are some of the things I'd want to see.
So I think you wrote in your book towards the conclusion, if I recall correctly, about how Judaism has never been static, right? That's just something that is what if anything defines Judaism, it's that it's not in any one age like it was in a previous age. It's always adapting and changing to modern situation.
Exactly. And, you do see certain communities that insist that like they're doing the traditional thing by kind of freezing practice in a certain time and place, which that's fine to do that. But like, I don't think it's appropriate to claim that as traditional, right? That's actually kind of a radical move to freeze Judaism in a particular time and place. Like Judaism's always been moving. It's always been influenced by surrounding cultures, right? To have a Judaism that insulates itself from surrounding cultures, that's really counter-traditional, right? We've always, whether it was the ancient rabbis being influenced by the Greeks, whether it was Middle Ages scholars like Maimonides being influenced by Muslims who were in his area, whether it's, people in Europe, this is sort of how we roll as Jews. So I think that is the essence of Jewish tradition.
Well, so nicely said. I couldn't agree more. I'm going to turn to some of the additional questions that have come in, if that's okay. And if anybody has additional questions to share, please enter them into the chat and I'll try to get to as many of them as we can. One question that came in is, in your book, you state that Judaism should be political. How do you merge both topics, politics and religion, in a positive and constructive manner when we are usually taught that these two things should be avoided?
It's a great question. I do sometimes get sort of pushback, which is like, wait a second, politics shouldn't be on the bima, Judaism shouldn't be political. And I understand where that's coming from. When I read the Torah, it's like, it seems impossible to me. The Torah is one of the most political documents I've ever read. The Torah is basically a polemic against the power structures of the ancient Near East. This is a document that is a passionate protest against the values of ancient Egypt, right? It's a document that, as I said earlier, wants to invert all the old power structures. So, the people of concern are the widow, the orphan, the poor, the stranger, rather than the emperor, the pharaoh, the king. Torah has a lot of thoughts about helping the poor, has a lot of thoughts about ending income inequality, like a lot, has a lot of thoughts endlessly about the stranger who is the immigrant, right? Who is the stranger? It is the non-Israelite. And there is quite an obsession. It's mentioned 36 times in the Torah about how we treat the stranger. So, that said, I don't think that there's, when it comes to modern political issues, whether it's immigration or healthcare or the economy, I don't think you can say there is one Jewish opinion on immigration or health care. Right? Jewish law is deep and vast and complex. And I think you can marshal Jewish law to make arguments on all sides of issues. I think some of them are better than others, but there's not only one Jewish voice on modern political issues. But to say that Judaism shouldn't engage at all in these issues, it's to disregard the most kind of foundational pillars of what Judaism is. Again, should Judaism be partisan? No, I don't think so. I don't think rabbis should be campaigning for a certain political party from the Bima, right? Let's be reasonable. However, to be very clear, what Judaism is not particularly diverse in, what there are not a lot of Jewish, there aren't many Jewish opinions on certain things like cruelty, like malicious lying, like corruption, like deliberate targeting and abuse of the vulnerable. There aren't arguments on both sides. There's one side, right? There's one Jewish side on those issues, and the side is basically no, right? We object to those things. Those are affronts to Judaism. So I think that when there are moments where political leaders are embodying those values, I do think it's a Jewish moment to speak out and say, hey, these values are being threatened. These are core Jewish values, and we're going to speak out about it. So, in short, I don't think Judaism cannot be political, right? I just think our founding document is so political. I don't know how we avoid that.
And to what you said earlier about machloket l'shem shamayim, arguments for the sake of heaven, one of the ways that Judaism really inspires political conversation is in the conversation piece of the politics, right? The debate and the ability for two people of differing opinions to come together in debate and to come out of that experience better, both of them better and more thoughtful and more open from that experience, not just from the Torah says this or the Torah says that, and that's it.
Right.
And I feel like I should define a couple of terms. So the bima in a Jewish space is the place where the raised space in a synagogue, where the rabbi would usually offer the sermon from or lead prayer from. So that's what the bima is. And the Torah, I should say, is the first 5 books of the 5 books of Moses, which are the central text. It's the central text of the Jewish tradition around which everything else is sort of encompassed and surrounds. The next question that came in was, let me see here, sorry. Give you a chance to take a sip of water. Are there other values or ethics from other religions that you lift up in your life and that you follow? Do you or have you practiced other religious traditions in those ways?
Yeah. So again, one of my goals is actually to study other traditions much more deeply than I have. I've done a little bit of reading, but not nearly enough. And I forget who said this, but I remember reading about an idea that there is a religious ecosystem in the world where each religious tradition is adding something of value to the whole, and to lose any one of them is actually to lose some important moral wisdom. And I really believe in that. I'm a big believer, my tradition is Judaism. That's what I'm going to be practicing. But I think that I really appreciate the wisdom other traditions offer. For me, I used to do meditation in kind of Buddhist spaces before I knew that there were Jewish spaces. So I did kind of pick up some Buddhist teaching, which I found to be incredibly valuable, especially kind of the Buddhist teaching around suffering and resistance. And, there's this idea that, there's necessary pain in life. Something difficult happens, I don't get a promotion at work. It's very painful. I'm sad about that. And that's pain, that's necessary. But the Buddhists say that we often add suffering on top of that, where we start to spin out stories like, I'm a failure. I'm never going to get a promotion. The rest of my life will be worthless. I never should have taken this job. That's just suffering, right? That's our mind spinning stories. And when we kind of just come back to the truth of what is, to the kind of thing that's happening in the present, which is I'm sad, I feel hurt, I feel rejected and disappointed. That's actually kind of a better way to approach life. So I really appreciate that. I appreciate a lot of the mindfulness meditation techniques that even in Jewish spaces, they're often incorporating those ideas from Buddhism into the teaching and the practice, because a lot of the teachers actually started out in Buddhism before there was the Jewish space. So I think that's probably the closest I've come to incorporating any other traditions into my life, but I definitely want to learn more about them.
What do you, a question from a student. Do you wrestle with how much of your Jewishness to reveal in public spaces? Like, how do you think about what to share and what not to share about your own?
Such a beautiful question. I really appreciate that. It is something that I have thought about lately, actually, quite a bit, especially in the last 4 or 5 years. I am actually, like, when I go out walking, I have a lot of Hillel t-shirts. I visited many Hillels. They give me t-shirts, which I love. And, I'm actually kind of conscious. I will sometimes turn the t-shirt inside out for safety reasons, where I actually think, like, is this safe to be walking around with a t-shirt with Hebrew on it? Like, is that really smart? That is a pretty sobering thing to be thinking. So when I'm in public, for safety reasons, I won't necessarily wear a shirt or wear something that tells everyone I'm Jewish. But I will say I try to be pretty open in general with people and let them know about my Judaism when it comes up. It's not something I ever want to feel like I'm hiding with people who I'm actually engaging with in any meaningful way, with strangers on the street, whatever. But, I do try to bring it up, actually. I do try to share it because it's such an important part of my life. To not share my Judaism would to really be hiding myself. And I don't want to live that way. And, there are times when it's like not well understood. I think we do live in a dominant Christian society. So, people often kind of interpret Judaism through a Christian lens and talk about it with Christian language and Christian terms that don't quite fit. So it can be hard to kind of bridge that gap and kind of explain things. It's like, I think people think that kind of Judaism is just like Christianity without Jesus, and that's not quite true. Right? They're pretty different traditions. So I think it can sometimes be challenging, and I find myself doing a lot of explaining, which can be tiresome sometimes, which is why I appreciate being in Jewish spaces, right? Just like it's a relief to be around people to whom I don't have to explain everything or justify everything. It's like we just kind of know. But I do try to share it as much as I can. And when I was in the White House, I was really open with my colleagues about exploring Judaism. And they were just, the Obama White House was really diverse. A lot of people with religious traditions that they were quite proud of and quite active in. And, my colleagues were just, they were so proud of me and so happy for me. And I actually remember one December, I was in the cafeteria in my building, and the White House chief of staff, this guy named Dennis McDonough, he walked in and he said to me, like, "Oh, what are you doing for the December holidays?" And I was about to go to a silent Jewish meditation retreat. I just thought, that is so weird to say to the White House chief of staff. Like, how he'll think I'm weird, I don't know. But then I thought, like, I'm not going to hide this. So I told him. And he just said to me, "Sarah, I am so proud of you. What an amazing thing to be doing with your time. Like, I'm just good for you." And he was so proud because Dennis is a religious Catholic. 2 of his 11 siblings are priests, right? Like, he got it. And so I really appreciated that welcome and that embrace.
That's such a beautiful example of how sometimes we are so different, and Judaism is legitimately so different, and yet sometimes being in religious or being encountering other people who are religious, you can also at the same time, despite your differences, have so much in common as well, right? Just that shared understanding and respect for what it is we're all hoping and trying to do in this life, trying to lead meaningful, reflective lives.
Yes.
And so to that point, there's another question, which you've touched on a little bit, but the idea of all Jews being Jews by choice. How do you reflect on that? And do you mentioned earlier the point that, technically, as a Jew, born to a Jew, you're a Jew, and there's really nothing you can do about that. And yet at the same time, there's this concept that, Jew by choice, which we sometimes often use to refer to people who convert to Judaism, is really all of us in America today. How do you kind of wrestle with that?
Yeah, in the kind of places where many Jews live, which are, large diverse cities, suburbs of those large diverse cities, you know, Jews are pretty accepted, right? There's certainly lots of parts of the country where that is not true, where Jews are not accepted and actually live pretty difficult existence. But in a lot of in the places where a lot of us live and study, you know, there is this acceptance, and we can kind of decide to just kind of blend in, right? To just kind of, you know, it's like, oh, I'm Jewish, just like you're Irish American, just like your, you know, your grandma was from Germany. Yeah, I'm Jewish that way. You know, we can choose to kind of do that, or we can choose to actually embrace Judaism. We can choose to actually do Judaism. And that isn't a choice that Jews always had, right? Before, you know, 150 years ago, when you were a Jew living in, you know, pick a European or Eastern European country, you weren't a citizen of that country, right? You were just a Jew. And then, you know, laws changed and suddenly you could be a Frenchman, whatever, and also a Jew, right? And today in America, like we can just be Americans if we want. And I think we have to decide whether we actually want to be Jewish. And I mean meaningfully Jewish, right? If you're born Jewish, if you've converted, you're Jewish. But I mean like deeply meaningfully Jewish. Do we want to actually explore? Do we actually want to embrace this identity? Do we want to share this part of ourselves? Do we want to learn? Do we want to kind of explore and interpret and try? Or do we kind of just want to like fade in and be vague ethnic Jews, which again, not a thing. And it's a choice that, you know, for most of my life, I was doing the latter, right? I was a cultural Jew, just kind of half-hearted. I wasn't really choosing Judaism. And then at some point, I decided to choose it. And it's been really meaningful to me. And I think that we need to, you know, I think it's sort of incumbent on us to show all of these young Jews why Judaism is worth choosing, that it is so much more than a couple of days a year at a synagogue and Hebrew school that they didn't love. Right? There's just so much more there for them.
And to that, there's another question that speaks to that, at least in my mind, which is, you know, not all of Judaism is necessarily so great. I mean, there are aspects of any religious tradition that can be challenging. Are there things about Judaism, traditional Judaism, Jewish life that you find to be challenging, and how do you reconcile that with choosing Judaism?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because when people say like, oh, well, what about the parts of Judaism that you find like offensive or difficult? And my answer is like, I can't think of any, but I know what they're talking about. They're actually talking about Orthodox Judaism, right? And like 90% of American Jews are not Orthodox Jews. And so, you know, in that 90% of the American Jewish community, like it's egalitarian. There aren't any kind of like restrictions on women that I can think about. Women are rabbis, women are synagogue presidents, girls are bat mitzvahed. You know, there is a total welcome of LGBTQ people, right? Like they are rabbis, they get married. Like there really is like officially, the denominations have officially embraced this. You know, in the 10% of the Jewish world that's Orthodox, which isn't, you know, that's not my tradition. Those are things that I am that do challenge me, right? The gender distinctions I find challenging. The lack of a full embrace of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. And like, that really bothers me, right? I really struggle with that. But, you know, it's funny, like, I also have a lot of friends in that community, and there are things about it that I really admire. I think their Shabbat practice is amazing. You know, when you go to an Orthodox community where people are having a deep and rigorous Shabbat, it's exquisite. And like the thickness and the richness of those communities is quite powerful. And there's a lot of, you know, and the Orthodox world is so diverse, right? Like you have people of like, I mean, the spectrum is so huge in that world. So I can't even totally characterize that. So I do find those aspects of Orthodoxy to be challenging, but that's not my tradition. Like that's not Judaism, right? I think sometimes people think that Orthodoxy is Judaism. That's the authentic Judaism. And what the rest of us are doing is kind of like a knockoff. And that's not true, right? That's, you know, Orthodoxy was an invention 150 years ago, right? Just like conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism, these are all relatively modern inventions. So that's no one owns kind of what Judaism really is.
This is a personal question, where do you see the boundaries then of where sort of where does Judaism end and other religious tradition or non-Jewish tradition begin? Like, if that being the case, which I totally and wholeheartedly agree with, is there a space outside of Judaism where if somebody were to say what I'm doing is Jewish, you would say, no, that's a little too far?
Such a great question. I really appreciate that, because it is sometimes something I kind of struggle with, where I'll see people doing something that they're claiming is Jewish. I'm like, okay, like, like, I mean, certainly, worshiping more than one God, not Jewish, right? Thinking Jesus is the son of God, not Jewish, right? Like there are certainly things that are pretty clearly not Jewish. As much as I might seem like I'm, kind of radical in my beliefs, for me, I think the most important thing is that people actually read our core traditional texts, the Torah, the Talmud, commentaries. Like, that's really important. And then if they want to do something interesting with them, if they want to interpret them, if they want to express them in an interesting way, I'm all for it. But I think you've got to actually know the tradition first. And I think sometimes when something is too far, it's because it's not grounded in anything at all, right? It's sort of just not, there's no text, there's no tradition, there's just not much there. It's kind of like, oh, I made this up because this is my Judaism, which again, like, okay, that's not a bad thing objectively, right? Please, you do you. But I do think that's personally where I draw my boundaries, is like, okay, what's that actually related to in these texts and traditions? And that's why I love the Svara Yeshiva, because they study, this is the queer radical yeshiva, they study ancient Jewish texts with such depth. Their goal is to know Judaism as well as the most learned Orthodox rabbi, because they want to be able to have a seat at the table, to interpret, to argue, to really have their place. And I love that. I just love it.
It seems to keep coming back to study and learning and concepts of informed choice, which
yes, and by learning, by the way, I don't just mean sitting with a text. Doing a Shabbat dinner is learning, right? Like having a Jewish wedding is learning, going to Israel is learning, engaging with food and music. People learn in all different ways. So like, you don't have to study in a room alone at all if that's not how you learn. So many ways to learn.
But the choice only comes after the information, right? You have to have the information to make the choice, right?
Yes.
What I think we have maybe time for one more brief question, which was that chapter 3 is titled "Freeing God from His Human-Shaped Cage in the Sky," and the question is, how did you come up with the title for that chapter?
Such a great question. It was kind of the image that I actually had, where, it actually came originally from when I've heard some of my Christian friends talking about having a God-shaped hole in their life. And I remember thinking, like, I have a God-shaped wall in my life. And it's like in the shape of this old man, and I just like can't surmount it, right? It's just this like old man shaped wall. And then that kind of got me to the idea of this, like, there is I do have a sense of the divine, but we have kind of stuck it into this cage that's shaped like an old man in the sky. And so I think that was the process by which I got to that title. But I had fun coming up with the chapter titles.
And I agree with the one who wrote the question. That was a particularly great chapter title. But and as I said before at the very beginning, it was a true joy and a profoundly meaningful experience as a rabbi to read the book that you wrote, the way that you wrote it, the way that you approached it, the way that you were successful in getting to the essence of what it is that we're all trying to do as we share our love for Judaism and what that's all about. And I'm so grateful to you. I'm sorry, I have to take advantage of the 3 minutes that we have left, because I have one more.
Sure.
I have one more personal question, which is,
please.
What are you reading now?
Oh man, such a great question. The honest answer is that I'm reading a lot of young adult dystopian novels, because my brain is kind of fried during the pandemic, and it's actually kind of almost all I can really tolerate. But I'm also reading a book, I forget what it's called. It's a really small little book by a professor at Cambridge, and it's called like The Small Book About God, which sounds like an interesting, and it's actually, he's sort of talking about God, the history of the God concept, and then he actually looks at gods through several different religious traditions, which I just find completely fascinating. So that's actually probably the one adult mature book that I'm reading right now. I'm also taking clinical pastoral education class, which is training that you do if you want to become a chaplain, which I probably won't become a chaplain, but I am interested in the training. And we've just read some really fascinating books about the work of chaplaincy, about learning about your family of origin. So those have also been on my reading list lately.
And my CPE, my clinical pastoral education process when I was in rabbinical school was one of the, if not the most meaningful experiences of my studies. I mean, it's just, I can still think back about some of those pastoral opportunities that I had by sitting at the bedside of people as they were struggling. I mean, yeah, as we say in Judaism, yesher koach to you for taking that on, because that is not easy. It is hard. It is emotionally hard, and it is mentally and even physically difficult to be doing that work. So, thank you for that and for all that you've done already for the Jewish people by sharing what you've shared in your writing and this evening. We're so grateful to you. Grateful to everybody who's joined us this evening. Want to remind those who are in need of the faculty development credit link. It is there in the chat, and I'm so proud of myself for at least twice remembering to mention that. I want to thank El Paso Community College for making this possible. Professor Eddie Treviso for helping to arrange for all of this and working behind the scenes so diligently on this project. Members of the Jewish community, members of the El Paso Community College community, members of the broader community, thank you for joining with us this evening. And to the interpreters, thank you. We're sorry if we went off script and sorry we may have made it difficult to you here and there, but we're grateful to you for making this even more accessible to a broader community as well. So Sarah, I'm just anxiously waiting to see what comes next for you, and I'm just so profoundly grateful for this opportunity this evening. Thank you so much for sharing your learning, your studies, and sharing yourself with us.
Thank you so much for having me. You are a joy to be in conversation with, and I hope one day we can do this in person, because it would be lovely to actually visit your community in person. So thank you.
It would be wonderful, and I speak on behalf of all of us. It would be wonderful to share an El Paso welcome with you, and to take you out for some real, El Paso food, and to welcome you in the proper way, and hopefully, as we say on Passover, next year Jerusalem, next year in El Paso, at some point in the future in El Paso. It would be such a privilege for us. We look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay. All right.